This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Cosmographia podcast with Randall Carlson. We are once again, and as always, joined by Bradley. What's up, Brad?
Hey, man, doing good
today? Doing good. Mike, how you doing out
there? Howdy, guys.
Good. And Randall, of course, star of the show. What's up, my man? Oops. I said, what's up?
Be careful now.
Oh, no. Giant mistake. Randall, how is it going, sir?
Well, I have no complaints. Here we are on March 21st. The world is in a weird place.
It is.
Yep.
It's the equinox already.
Oh, the equinox is come and gone.
Yep. It's yesterday. Yeah, it was yesterday, I think.
Officially spring in the northern hemisphere.
19th, actually. It was extra early this year, irregularly early.
Extra early, yes. So, we are hoping that everything sort of normalizes within the next few weeks so we can get back out in the field and not have any extra roadblocks there on that front, because we don't really need that in our long-term game plan, which requires being able to move about, collecting data,
right,
investigating sites. But I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will run its course.
I think so. I think it's going to run its course. Hopefully
and
sooner.
We can also hope that the environment, the post crisis environment, is going to be conducive to an economic rebound.
Yeah.
Rather than going into some prolonged depression. But I know that my good friend Ian, we've talked about the restaurant that I've been building, which is now about 2 weeks from being ready to open, basically. And we don't know where we're going to be at in 2 weeks, so we're going to be able to open. But his other restaurant, yesterday morning, had to lay off 30 employees.
Oof.
So you got to wonder if some of the response isn't worse. A lot of questions raised about this whole thing, the way it's played out.
Same thing is happening with our business. Kyle and I are, we work in the agriculture side of like an orchard for olives and grapes, and we have a tasting room in town that sells wine and olive oil and food and stuff. And they've had to shut the tasting room down. Now Kyle and I are still able to go to work out on the farm part.
Yeah.
But the tasting room, obviously, which is more like a restaurant or a bar, had to close down for safety. And since everyone else is doing it, you can't be the only one open for seemingly quote unquote ignoring the problem. So it is an interesting thing happening right now. So.
Yeah. But we're here to talk about interesting things that happened 12,800 and some years ago.
Right. Let's put it in perspective.
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. We would have been worse off during that period of time by far than we are now. In fact, in some cases, the mortality rate may have been as much as 100%. Yeah. We're going to refer to a study that came out in 2011 by Jesse A.M. Ballinger, and his focus was on the American southwestern deserts and what happened at the end of the Younger Dryas as far as human population. And this was published in Quaternary International, like I said, in 2011. He asked this question: whether or not abrupt Younger Dryas climate change affected regional paleo environments and late Pleistocene hunter-gatherer populations is an important topic in the archaeology of the American Southwest. This paper reviews multiple age-resolved proxy evidence to gauge the magnitude and direction of the Younger Dryas chronozone, which is just a fancy term for the Younger Dryas, as a marker, particularly within the stratigraphic context. The magnitude and direction of the Younger Dryas chronozone environmental changes in different settings and systems. There are impressive records of vegetation, faunal, stable isotope, and geomorphological change coincident with the YDC, which is the Younger Dryas chronozone. These correlate with important adaptive changes in human hunting and land use, as revealed in the analysis of spatio-temporal distribution of late Pleistocene hunting technologies. Significant cultural changes that coincide with the YDC include the Clovis to Folsom transition, the demise of mammoth hunting, and the development of an emphasis on bison, increased regionalization, and this is the key part right here, the abandonment of the Northwest Chihuahuan and Sonoran deserts by mobile big game hunters. So for centuries, there had been evidence of this being the Chihuahua Desert and the Sonoran Desert being actually much more humid with a lot more vegetation, and the existence of a very prevalent mobile hunting culture in that region. Younger Dryas begins, and what happens? The abandonment. So when they use the word abandonment, you would think, well, these people moved elsewhere, and that may have possibly been it. But the point is that they were there and then they were not there. Nobody is really necessarily knowing, though, if they moved, where did they move? Okay. Now, in that region, this was the San Pedro Valley of southeastern Arizona. I think I showed this last time, but it's quite impressive and worth looking at again. This is the black mat.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. So there was cultural activity below, but not above. So this is an illustration from Ballinger. So then he goes on to say, the post-Clovis, this is in the, actually in the, is this the abstract? No, I don't think it's the abstract. It doesn't matter where it actually shows up, but this is in his report. The post-Clovis archaeological record of the Southwest has been explained by the early development of a desert archaic adaptation. The most significant post-YDC change in material culture is the appearance of groundstone and pinto type and notch projectile points that occur between 9 and 8,000 carbon 14 years ago. So this is post Younger Dryas, and what he's talking about, the pinto type there is just the type of point that showed up several thousand years after the abandonment of these regions by the Clovis culture. He points out, he says, in the southeastern Arizona, a noticeable 1,400 year hiatus occurs in the archaeological record following Clovis and Pleistocene extinctions. Western stemmed projectile points are also rare in southern Arizona. In any case, there's presently no compelling evidence for hunters or gatherers in the northwestern Chihuahuan Desert or the Sonoran Desert interior during the YDC. So in other words, this particular area, which covers a vast area of the Southwest when you include both those two deserts, did have cultural activity going on which ceased right at the Younger Dryas boundary. And he actually refers to the extinction of the Clovis culture, which is, I think, is a legitimate way to describe it.
So these people occupied these areas that are now desert. Does that imply that they weren't as arid? Okay.
Yes, it does. It does. And I mean, they were a mobile hunting culture, so there was a lot
that's
of big game.
Right. And that's recent, geologically speaking, for a place to be not arid, and now it is. Right?
Yeah,
usually,
yeah.
Okay,
well, we find that to be the case all over the world.
Okay.
The
right.
desertification has occurred in many places quite rapidly.
Wow.
So they conclude attention is drawn to chronological correlations that exist between the Younger Dryas chronozone as measured in the Greenland ice cores, regional paleo-environmental changes, and major human adaptive changes during the Balling-Alarod Younger Dryas transition, including the appearance and then the disappearance of Clovis technologies at approximately 12.8 thousand years before present. Second, a switch in large animal prey from mammoth and bison to primarily bison. So bison were one of the mega mammals that somehow managed to survive the mass extinction event. Remember, we've talked about it. I mean, there were, dozens of species that went extinct, but dozens of species survived. In North America, it was roughly, I think we're going to say about 70% of extant species at the terminal Pleistocene went extinct during that transition from Pleistocene to Holocene. And among the ones that survived were bison. Musk oxen was another one of the mega mammals. Moose. In the case of bison, though, the species did diminish in size from, the super bison, which may have been a precursor species. I'm not quite sure if the super bison and the post, the Holocene bison, which was considerably smaller, where it was actually descended. I presume it was. I don't know the exact genetic sequencing there. That's an interesting study that I would like to do, but there is so much. So Folsom regionalization, population growth from about just after 12,700 years to 11,700 years ago. So it would appear there was about a 200-year hiatus before the first Folsom artifacts started showing up. So the apparent abandonment of the northwestern Chihuahuan deserts and Sonoran deserts by hunter-gatherer populations after 12.8 thousand years before present, and the reappearance of people in the stratigraphic record of those deserts around 10,000 carbon-14 years, which was about 11,000 or 11.5 thousand years BP. So there's that interesting date again, which is now, the end of the Younger Dryas between 11.5 and 11.6. So real measurable cultural activity shows up in these areas, as it says here, they're giving a date at 11,500 years ago. So for the most part, these areas were, any cultural activity was absent. So then that raises the question, what became of the people that were there? And it really, did they move somewhere else, or were they essentially eliminated?
Yeah, once again, that it almost points to them moving somewhere else, because we have all of these, fossils of the various animals that were there, but there are no Clovis bones again. So it seems that if they had been destroyed with all of these animals. We should find their bones all over the place in these same layers.
One would think. Although, maybe the circumstances between, if you have a mass mortality event, is it going to impact humans the same way as Mega Man? I don't know. If carcasses are left just laying on the landscape, they are not going to last long. Right.
So the humans would have escaped any kind of flooding that may have deposited them in these.
And then succumbed later.
Right, died from lack of food or fresh water or whatever.
Yes. Because we know that during some of the big plague events in history, the mortality was so widespread that people weren't getting buried. Their carcasses were just being left right there on the ground to decay naturally. To generally presumed succumb to scavengers of various types, macro scale scavengers as well as microbial scale scavengers.
Right.
So then, into the work of David Anderson and Albert Goodyear, they wrote a paper which came out in Veterinary International.
Yo, RH3VB954.
Multiple lines.
Thank you for watching. You're the best.
For possible human population decline / settlement reorganization during the early Younger Dryas. So the Paleo-Indian Database of the Americas, which is abbreviated PIDBA, integrates database and geographic information system technology to provide location data for almost 30,000 Paleo-Indian projectile points, measurements, and other qualitative data, attribute data on more than 15,000 points, and provides photographs and or line drawings for nearly 10,000 Paleo-Indian points from across North America. And any independent researcher can access the Paleo-Indian Database of the Americas. Put it in your search engine, go there, and you can begin to do research on the distribution of Paleo-Indian cultures over a period of thousands of years. So when Anderson, Albert Goodyear, James Kennett, Alan West began to investigate and just begin to statistically analyze the Paleo-Indian database, what they discovered was, and I quote, "These data clearly indicate a major decrease in the number of artifacts in many parts of North America during the early centuries of the Younger Dryas. This decrease is interpreted to represent a decline in human populations and or a major reorganization of settlement systems, something likely related to major changes in biota observed over the same general interval. In the southeastern U.S., now we just looked at the Ballinger study, which was the Southwest. Looking over at the southeastern U.S., this decline is particularly dramatic. The pattern of immediate post-Clovis decline in eastern North America is also similar in the central part of the continent, in an area defined by 21 states and provinces in the Great Basin, Rocky Mountains, and Great Plains. So this is a big chunk of the North American continent. All three data sets that they looked at, which included projectile points, quarries, and a statistical analysis of the radiocarbon dates that would be associated with human activity, called SPA data, basically showed that there was a major human population decrease, which they refer to as a bottleneck, or alternatively, population reorganization, which they would described as being dramatic changes in settlement pattern. Right. So if though the Clovis culture survived and simply moved somewhere, then it should be apparent that, okay, their cultural activity ended here, but there's a continuation of it over here. Do we find that? That's the question. The SPA results provide evidence that similar declines or changes occurred across much of the remainder of the Northern Hemisphere. Of the Northern Hemisphere,
Wow.
it seems, with the exception of the Middle East. A wide range of evidence indicates that conditions during the initial few centuries of the Younger Dryas caused a significant drop in human populations or dramatic reorganizations of settlement in North America, and possibly also broadly throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And we will take a look here at
I just want to say the quarries they're talking about are usually flint quarries, right? They're talking about where
Yeah,
they're
well-
mining tool material.
yes. Okay. Here is showing from the Paleo-Indian database, showing distribution of various points, artifacts over North America prior to the start of the Younger Dryas. Particularly look at how dense you see in the eastern woodlands and along the eastern coastal region. And undoubtedly, you'll note that this yellow line here is the shelf, which is very close to where the coastline would have been. Now, at the late glacial maximum, which was the lowest. Now, by the time we get to the Younger Dryas, sea level has come up, significantly from its minus 400 feet low point. But it's already started to drown the coastlines that would have been, if there were people there, assuming there were people there, that would have been occupying the coastlines prior to the Bolling and the Alarod, going back into the late glacial maximum, which takes us back 14 to 15 to 16,000 years ago. And if there would have been a concentration of human settlement along the coastlines, of course, even by the time we get to the Younger Dryas and the first appearance of the Clovis, the coastline of the late glacial maximum is already underwater. So there's already been a forced migration landward away from the sea because of rising sea levels that were underway at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. But yeah, so here you see the number of points in the distribution. And then this area here is the Mississippi Valley, the Great Basin, the Colorado Plateau area. So then we'll go and we'll see 1,000 years later, the Folsom. Now, look at the eastern sector of North America. And let's compare. Go back. Clovis, 1,000 years later. Look at over here along in California, along the western coast, in the Great Basin, in the Basin and Range province over here. Clovis points and the prevalence of Clovis points, and now will come 1,000 years later. Now, what we're seeing here in this area is Folsom. Now, an interesting subject for study and further clarification is going to be what is the precise linkage between Clovis and Folsom.
Right.
However, in many cases, there appears to be this hiatus. In some cases, 300, 400, 500 years. In other cases, like it said, up to 1,400 years before you begin to see the advent of this new cultural type, which was given a different name because it was just so distinctly different. So it's called the Folsom rather than the Clovis. Quite impressive. Also notice up here into Alberta, this is now during the period when presumably the ice-free corridor has begun to open up And so Clovis people have begun to move in there, hunters and so on, and they've left a bunch of artifacts behind. And then 1,000 years later, they're gone. So that's a pretty impressive graphic there. Then we've got another graphic here, which is quarries. And the number of artifacts that were found are typically these quarries, they're going to be cutting the stone, and then they're going to be, chipping the stone in order to create their points, their spear points, and whatever other artifacts are being made out of the stone of these particular quarries. So they looked at 3 different quarries, one at Topper, South Carolina, one in Tennessee, and one in Kentucky, all which showed considerably active. You find a number of, I forget what the exact area is of that they were looking at, but in whatever the unit area, whether it was a certain number of square meters, I think it was probably a certain number of square meters based on the total artifacts found. You'll see in Topper, you go from 400, in some maybe like 450. At Tennessee one, it looks like about 800. Adams, Kentucky, you're getting up there close to 1,000 artifacts found. Then you get to the Younger Dryas right here, transition from green to red. So in other words, along with the abandonment of these cultural sites that you saw it in the previous diagram, you've also got the abandonment of these quarries. So in other words, they're showing activity for 200, 300, 400 years, considerable amount of activity, and then boom, no activity at all. So
They killed all the mammoths. Didn't need to make any more tools.
well, that
Right.
must have been it. So
Well, one of the things about Clovis artifacts is that's looked at in terms of their level of expertise is the actual materials that they went to great lengths to get in order to make them. So it is interesting. It's like that knowledge, even if the Clovis and Folsom people are the same people or connected, it's like they lost that knowledge of how to find or the right materials, the best
locations.
materials. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, not only the locations, but they never, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Recaptured them.
Yeah. So it just seems to me like a loss of knowledge about where to go, where to get the material, why you would get that material, why it makes better artifacts.
And that correlates in the very steep drop off of activity in the quarries where they were
That's-
getting the material.
yeah.
Okay. Cool.
So in that same year, in the year 2011, there was another study published in Quaternary International. Lead authors were J. Christopher Ellis, H. Dillon, Dylan H. Carr, and Thomas J. Lobel, I think. The article, The Younger Dryas and the Late Pleistocene Peoples of the Great Lakes Region. So they say the Late Pleistocene archaeological record of the Great Lakes drainage area shows that there were several changes in that record in a time period corresponding to the Younger Dryas climatic reversal. Notable here are declines in some areas in the mobility of Paleo-Indian groups as measured by distance to the main lithic source employed. Right? That being the lithic source, presumably the quarry, right?
Right.
Second, declines in the overall frequency of sites and find pots, particularly in the western Great Lakes, where some areas seem to have been largely abandoned, and an increasing association of occupation locales with glacial lake shores or extensive wetlands left by recently drained glacial lakes. Some of the changes, as in range mobility, most likely relate to the colonization of new areas rather than directly to the younger Dryas. Specifically, the earliest groups were able to target rich but widely dispersed resource locales due to an absence of competing groups. Now, what did they just say right there?
They're able to go far and wide to get these materials because they're not fighting with each other, or they don't have to compete for those materials.
Yeah, because they're saying the colonization of new areas. So in other words, these areas that they're describing and studying around the Great Lakes have been abandoned. Now you have recolonization of those same areas. And as it says, the earliest groups that now come in afterwards were able to target
This is a trainer.
rich but widely dispersed resource locales due to an absence of competing groups. In other
No one was
words,
there. Yeah.
you've got a catastrophe. It wipes everybody out. There's nobody there for centuries. Now you have colonizers, people coming in and reoccupying that land. And there's no competing groups there. That's what they're saying, see?
Yeah.
So that's now a study that's, and we can begin to find these studies. More and more of these kinds of studies are showing this disruption in human settlement patterns.
And think about
It's a double beam trainer. I got it on
I'm
Amazon.
just picturing it. If you're in that later group that's coming in, now of course the landscape has been massively changed by the cataclysms that have happened. But you're still going to see, if you're very paid a lot of attention to the landscape, which these kinds of people did, you're going to see evidence of human occupation that's very old, that's been totally abandoned, and you're going to know, like, okay, we've been walking through this land, there's no one here. Obviously something very, very powerful happened here recently, and look, people were here, but they're not here anymore.
But they're gone.
Yeah, must have been eerie.
I'm sure it was. Yeah, absolutely it would have been.
Yeah.
No question. So, yeah, and there's new studies coming out, or since the last, this one that I just quoted from was from 9 years ago. Here's a study that came out in 2013, so it's a little bit more recent, only 7 years ago, right? This was Felipe Crombie and 15 other authors, published in Quaternary International. Title of the article, Hunter-Gatherer Responses to the Changing Environment of the Moorvart Paleo Lake in northwest Belgium during the late glacial and early Holocene. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, so I'm sure if anybody out there speaks Belgian, it probably help me get the correct pronunciation. So this paper presents new geoarchaeological perspectives on the late glacial and early Holocene human occupation around a large paleo lake, Moorvart. I'll just say that. That's what I'll say. Moorvart Paleo Lake, approximately 25 square kilometers in area. Intensive field work using invasive and non-invasive survey techniques combined with modeling of the paleo topography and paleo groundwater and multi-proxy paleoecological analysis. Everybody knows now the word paleo just means old, from back, in archaic times. So the old topography, the old groundwater patterns, and the old ecology, right, that pre-existed the modern. So you've got the modeling of the paleotopography and paleo groundwater and multi-proxy paleoecological analysis have resulted in a detailed reconstruction of the landscape during the final Paleolithic and early Mesolithic occupation of the area. a major shift in the occupation from a cultural group called the Feder-Messer culture. And the Feder-Messer culture is an archaeological umbrella term, includes late Paleolithic and upper Mesolithic cultures of the northern European plain, which dates mostly to between, and get this date, 14,000 years to 12,800 years. This is the Feder-Messer culture, right? So notice that the dating of this particular cultural group almost precisely coincides with the Clovis.
With the Clovis.
Yeah. So that 12,800 years ago is referred to in terms of European archaeology as the late Magdalenian, right? Yeah. And then there was a separate culture that got a different name called the Ahrensburg culture sometime after 12,800 years ago. So in reference to this Feder-Messer culture, the authors here say that a major shift in the occupation from the Feder-Messer culture to the early Mesolithic was contemporaneous with a sudden and drastic change in the paleohydrology of the area, which they put at the end of the Alarod. So, and they're dating it roughly to 13,000 calibrated years before present, which coincided with a short but abrupt cooling event. The population decline, which followed this hydrological event, was then reinforced by the prevailing cold and harsh conditions of the Younger Dryas, and probably lasted until the Pre-Boreal. So we're seeing the same kind of evidence now coming in from Europe, showing that there was a population crash very close to that Younger Dryas boundary. And then what appears to have been a hiatus throughout some portion of the Younger Dryas. Extensive geoarchaeological research along a large paleolake from the late glacial in northwestern Belgium has provided valuable new paleo-environmental evidence permitting a better understanding of the occupation dynamics of the area during the final Paleolithic. The previously observed occupational contrast between the Feder-Messer culture of the Alarod and the early Mesolithic of the Boreal is clearly due to a major environmental change in the paleohydrology of the area. This change occurred as a sudden event. So the event was responsible for a drastic decline of human occupation in the area, which most likely persisted until the Pre-Boreal. So there we have it, a drastic decline in human occupation that pretty much existed through most of the, or all of the Younger Dryas. So, what do you make of this?
Well, that's showing us that most of the northern hemisphere was affected by this same event.
Well, that's
in terms of
what
human habitation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it's starting to look like. And there are more studies that are coming in that I haven't had a chance to really review yet. But Western Asia, for example, there appears to be a population crash in the Euphrates Valley. There appears to also have been studies coming out of Japan now, which suggest a population crash in Japan. So there is a lot of interesting stuff, and we're going to try to pull it all together as much as possible over the next few episodes, so that we can compile a lot of this information in one place and make it available to people.
Yeah, it's really interesting too and suggestive that it didn't affect the Middle East, or at least we don't see the same proxies, I'll call them, for that cultural change. And thinking back on the series of Atlantis episodes, they perhaps sustained a culture that was able to tell these stories and maintain a sort of historical record through that disaster. Mm-hmm. And they learned of other cultures that declined or were completely destroyed. That's cool.
Yeah.
So the Dogon people that were in Japan?
No, the Dogon people were in sub-Saharan Africa.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, not the Dogon. Yeah. Well, that doesn't matter. I know we've looked at this ancient Japanese culture, and they're very interesting. And I do remember there being a population crash around that time. They also supposedly had some of the earliest ceramics, pottery, earliest known.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
So,
are you thinking about the Ainu?
Not the Ainu. What are they called? I'll find it.
Strange-looking spaceman statues.
Yeah.
Is that what you're thinking of? I can picture that, but I don't recall their name. Like it had a space kind of helmet on.
Right. Yeah, they had some very strange statues.
Right. Brandon, are you switching paper here? Do we want to take a little break?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, we're right at the time for a break. All right, we're gonna take a quick break. Be right back. All right, and we are back from the quick break we took. Randall, we ready to keep going here? What's the next?
Well, let's
take a step back.
I was going to say let's expand our perspective even more.
Okay.
This is from a study that appeared. This goes way back to 1992, years before the impact hypothesis was even introduced. And there's no effort here to make the case for catastrophe. It's just what the evidence seems to imply. Now, looking back in the context of what we know now, this appeared in the journal American Antiquity. Authors were A.M.T. Moore and G.C. Hillman.
Wow, 1992.
So they were archaeologists. The title of the article was "The Pleistocene to Holocene Transition and Human Economy in Southwest Asia, the Impact of the Younger Dryas." And they go on to say that we present new evidence suggesting that the late glacial worldwide episode of cooling, known as the Younger Dryas, had a significant impact on climate, vegetation, and human economy in Southwest Asia. In the Levant, a new pollen core and plant remains from the early village of Abu Huraira, which has been in the news recently, indicate that forest gave way to steppe in response to the onset of drier climatic conditions contemporary with the Younger Dryas. Similar effects may be seen in pollen cores from elsewhere in Southwest Asia. Now, it should be pretty obvious that as plant species change with a changing climate or changing environment, the seeds and the spores and the pollens that they give off are going to change likewise. So this stuff is preserved in the stratigraphic record. So a scientist looking at these changing pollen types or changing spore or plant types can draw pretty accurate inferences about the changing of the environment. The alteration in climate and vegetation obliged the inhabitants of Abu Huraira to modify their plant gathering and led to significant disruptions in culture and settlement over a wide area. We argue that the stresses induced by these events were a contributing factor in the subsequent development of agriculture in Southwest Asia. So that was one of the main cultural adaptations as we see this shifting from hunter-gatherer based cultures to agricultural based culture. Also, a very distinct shift in plant usage, because at the cultural sites, they're processing plants. They're eating plants, right? Food plants or whatever plants that they're using for various purposes. There's major changes that were associated likewise there. So very soon after the start of the Younger Dryas, we see a more abrupt and unequivocal change, a complete cessation of the use of asphodel seed that was used for both food and medicine, and a dramatic decline in the use of wild cereals and at least some of the grass species. So in other words, they're seeing, up until the Younger Dryas, they're seeing this evidence of this plant use that then at the onset of the Younger Dryas ceases. These people are not, there's no evidence that these people are, that there's people there using these plants. That's what I'm trying to say. The pollen sequences all suggest that the colder conditions of the Younger Dryas had a significant impact on vegetation throughout Southwest Asia and also in the extreme southeast of Europe. Everywhere, the Younger Dryas in Southwest Asia was accompanied by a decrease in moisture that caused a temporary reversion to partially steppic conditions more typical of the Plana glacial. In other words, it got a lot colder and it got a lot drier. So whatever people had been living there and had been adapted to the prevailing environment pre-Younger Dryas, suddenly the environment is very, very different. It should be also be noted that the 5 pollen cores cited earlier exhibit synchrony not only with the Younger Dryas episode, but also with 2 preceding changes in vegetation cover. So there was a series of shifts in climate and environment, and then the granddaddy was the shift from into the Younger Dryas. Kyle, would you look up the Natufian culture for us? Natufian, the Natufian culture.
Isn't it interesting also that a lot of the culture, this agriculture starts up after the end of the Younger Dryas.
Yes.
Whereas before that, the hunter-gatherer thing seemed to work. So it's almost like there was a response to a loss of both animal and plant material, to where they started trying to do husbandry and taking care of it themselves so that they could eat, because there just wasn't enough around anymore, or something like that. I don't know. It's an interesting thing that it's after this cataclysm that the agriculture starts up.
Yeah, so Wikipedia says the Natufian culture is a late Epipaleolithic archaeological culture that existed from around 12,000 to 9,500 BC.
Okay,
Or-
so they would be
yeah.
basically post Younger Dryas. You said. From what were the
Yeah,
dates again?
12,000 to 9,500 BC in the Levant.
Oh, 12,000. Okay, so 14,000. Okay. Because BC is where it gets
Right.
confusing. When you're talking about historical, they'll use BC, and when you're talking about geological, they'll use BP. Most of the study goes on to say that most of the more substantial sites in the Natufian heartland were inhabited during the earlier stages of that culture. It is on those sites and several others, that the Natufian culture has been found in its most developed form. They were substantial sites with huts and other structures, rich assemblages of bone and ground stone artifacts, and also exquisite natural carvings in bone and stone. As Gerard noted in her original survey of the culture, and Vala and Henry have since reaffirmed, most of those elements ceased to be made in the later Natufian, and occupation on sites in the heartland was disrupted. It now appears that this disturbance in the pattern of settlement in the later Natufian coincided with the environmental deterioration at the start of the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas climatic episode evidently had a significant impact on the environment of Southwest Asia. It interrupted the late glacial improvement in climate and vegetation and caused a return to the conditions of the pleniglacial. The consequences were severe for the Epi-Paleolithic II peoples of the Levant. Their modes of gathering were disrupted, and the resulting stresses led to
was left. See what I'm saying?
So this, go
Get
ahead,
it again.
and
Yeah.
I'll do a share screen of the graphic that Brad had up.
Right.
Yeah, so if you were looking at that on a globe, then these two areas would actually be, you could consider them connected through the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah.
Right. However, the Australasian tektite field is from a completely separate event.
Okay.
Okay.
And what this graphic is doing is showing that the Australasian tektite field has been known for decades. The source crater or source impact has been a mystery. I think there's some new research that's just come out on there that they possibly have located an impact epicenter that's responsible for this. But it was considered up
that's
to
come
this
out
point.
in the last couple months.
Yeah. The Australasian tektite field was considered to be the largest, most widespread tektite field on Earth. So what they're doing here in this graphic is they're showing, by comparison, the Younger
Okay.
Dryas boundary field. And so
I see.
Abu Huraira, that we were just talking about, is this red dot here. One of the Belgium studies in that area that I was referring to, and other studies up here in northwestern Europe. And then, of course, multiple studies in North America, and then even a study down in Venezuela, which is, I think, William Mahaney and others that we will talk about those interesting studies. This one in the red dot here in Mexico is the studies we talked about by
Chihuahuan.
Lake
Alcantara.
Cuitzeo.
Yes, Lake
Okay.
Lake Cuitzeo, exactly. However, there are new studies that actually extend the boundaries of the Younger Dryas. This should actually be YDB. So this is very confusing. The Younger Dryas boundary field. So there are new studies that actually,
Younger boundary Dryas field.
yes, that too. So yeah, that have extended the considerably, which we will address. So
If I had a prize, there was one person that pointed that out. I did.
This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is a special episode of the Cosmographia podcast with Randall Carlson. This is for Asteroid Day, right, Randall? The presentation you have for Asteroid Day?
yes, well, yeah. I would say yes. But the one thing that I was a little confused about is that aren't all the episodes special? Or is it just this
Well.
one is special? I
It's-
was thinking all along that they were all special. But
I
this
think they
one
are.
then could be considered extra special.
Right. It's special relative to the other episodes. Yeah.
Well, I thought what we would do is we would just introduce some ideas that are going to be very much expanded upon in the upcoming episodes. And it would be appropriate to release it on or about June 30th, which, as you said, Asteroid Day. So why is June 30th chosen as Asteroid Day? Brad, would you like to comment on that?
Well, it's the anniversary of the Tunguska event over central Russia, in 1908.
In 1908.
So they decided to make this an annual event to try to raise awareness of there being more and more in our space around us that we're aware of. So they need to make the people aware of that so they can get funding and start detecting these things and maybe protecting the planet from them.
So let's a little more background on Asteroid Day. Who came up with the idea and who actually started it? It wasn't the B12 Foundation, was it?
It may be some of the prior astronauts. I don't know that 100%.
I think it was. Perhaps Kyle, you would look up Asteroid Day.
On it.
You're on it.
One of
man.
them is Rusty Schweikert,
Schweikert,
and
mhm.
Ed Liu.
That makes sense.
They're part of the B612 Foundation.
Mhm.
They've got a Sentinel mission. They're mapping the inner solar system of all the orbiting objects. They're trying to get a telescope in space to better detect the objects out there. But it's just in the past 2 years that it's been recognized by the UN as an international
Mhm.
event or an international day. So
This is really cool. Asteroid Day was co-founded in 2014 by Dr. Brian May, astrophysicist and lead guitarist
Right.
of Queen,
Queen, right.
together with Danica Remy,
Mm-hmm.
president of B612
Yep.
Foundation,
I knew there was the B612 connection.
Rusty Schweikert,
Brad just
Apollo
mentioned
9 astronaut, and filmmaker Grig Richters, I guess.
him. Mhm.
So yeah,
So
rock
that's
and
it.
roll and asteroids.
yeah, I forgot
Rock
about
and roll
Brian
and
May.
asteroids. I've always thought that was a good fit. So, 1908, June 30th, early in the morning. Would have been around 7:30 local time, give or take a few minutes. And what happened? Well, it depends on, I guess, your vantage point. Interestingly, it appears that there's nobody who is documented to have died immediately from the event. There are stories that probably some people, some of the older citizens that were the Tungusi people that were within the vicinity may have suffered to the extent where their demise was hastened. Because there were people that were literally, even though they weren't within the blast zone itself, the shock wave moving out was enough that even 30 and 40 miles away, people were blown off their feet. Some cases, people blown 20 and 30 feet through the air to smash against a tree or whatever. So, there was undoubtedly sustained injuries, but there were no documented deaths of any individuals directly as the result of the explosion. Now, there was a herd of reindeer, as we talked about, that apparently was incinerated because they were grazing very near the epicenter. Let's pull up a.
And I know you'll get into this, but I mean, just to be clear with it up front, it is June 30th annually because that is the annual return of one of the torrid stream meteor showers.
Yes, and we certainly should talk about that too, because this ties in with everything we've been talking about up to this point regarding the Younger Dryas impact and the possible connection between the Younger Dryas impact or impacts and the Taurid meteor system, the family of Taurid meteor streams that all seem to be interconnected and to be the progeny of perhaps one really big comet that came into the inner solar system sometime between 20 and 30,000 years ago. I would say actually more like 25 to 30,000 years ago, because I have a strong suspicion that if this bears out, that there was in fact, and it's appearing pretty incontrovertible at this point, a very large comet that came into the solar system, I would be looking for some sort of a climatic or biotic signature of that event. And what we do in fact find is that generally what's considered the final phase of the Wisconsin Ice Age, which is usually called the late Wisconsin, really got active around 26,000 years ago. So it is quite well documented that if you go back, say, 30 to 40,000 years ago, the vast ice complex was considerably contracted from what it was at its late glacial maximum around 18 to 20,000 years ago, you see. So, but the question remains, and it's a question we're going to examine in more detail, is how extensive was that recession or contraction of the ice masses in that that interval, generally referred to as an interstadial. Do you remember those terms, guys? Glacial, interglacial, stadial, interstadial. Right. You know, glacial, interglacial, and then stadial, interstadial. So you'll have fluctuations of extraordinary magnitude, such as the shift from full glacial, which was the late Pleistocene, into interglacial, which is now, which is a very much contracted version of the ice sheets, the planetary ice sheets. Although we know that there have been episodes where the ice globally has been far less than now, meaning that sea levels have been 20, 30, 40 feet higher than now, frequently throughout Earth history, which would then imply even less ice than now. Full glacial, what we could do is, for a rough concept, we could basically double the amount of glacial ice on the planet now to get the amount of glacial ice in the late Pleistocene. Or I should say, the Pleistocene is the 2.5 million years, but the late Wisconsin is the last phase of ice growth in North America and in North America. In Europe, it's the Fennoscandian, but the Fennoscandian ice sheet, which was actually the Weschelian ice phase, which the Weschelian coincides with the Wisconsin in North America. So the Weschelian in Europe was the name given to the last phase of ice growth. The ice sheet itself was called the Fennoscandian. Just like in North America, the last phase of the ice age was the Wisconsin, but the ice sheets themselves were the Laurentide and the Cordilleran. Got that? Okay, so people are clear on that. So there was a late Wisconsin interstadial where the climate warmed. And somewhere between, say, in 30 and 40,000 years ago, there were extensive forests growing in Canada, where 10,000 years later, there was extensive ice sheets. Now, the question is how much, let's say, how much was the totality of glacial recession in that interval there compared to now? And of course, another auxiliary study that would help one understand that would be studies of sea level. Because obviously, the more the ice is reduced on the land, the higher the ocean level is going to come, right? So when we look at this problem, we're not only going to look at evidence for what the ice was doing on the land, we're going to look at evidence for what was going on with sea levels. Because as the ice is growing on land, sea levels are falling. When ice is shrinking on land, sea levels are rising, right? So we have this, it's almost like a breathing in, out or something, but we can see that this has happened many times throughout the Pleistocene. And in fact, that is really could be the signature phenomena that characterizes the Pleistocene, is this glacial expansion and contraction repeatedly that didn't seem to be going on in the previous epoch, the Pliocene, at least certainly not to the extent that it began to do once the Pleistocene got underway around 2.5 million years ago. So interesting questions. Now, I guess let's see. We're getting at. I'm going around here. I'm trying to get back to my original thought, but the Tunguska event. Okay, so the Tunguska event, we're looking at an event that would be very much an analog for what might have happened during the Younger Dryas. And so, at the Younger Dryas, we've got to get the picture in our heads. Somewhere around 26,000 years ago, whatever that was there, either probably there was some ice, but drastically reduced, it began to expand. It expanded and grew and grew. The sea levels went down. Between 18 and 20,000 years ago, it appeared to have been the LGM, the late glacial maximum. Then, over a period of a couple of thousand years, and this, as I've been going through the literature, I find that there's no real agreement on at what point did the late glacial maximum really begin to significantly shrink back. Some studies would suggest that it was around 15,000 to 16,000 years ago that it began to shrink back. But slowly, more gradually, and this slower gradual shrinking back could be considered, if you think of it this way, could be thought of as being driven by the much slower astronomical changes, what is the so-called Milankovitch phenomena, which depends upon precessional motion. It depends on the obliquity of the ecliptic. It depends on the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit, and how these things interact will change the amount of solar radiation reaching the surface, sometimes increasing it, sometimes decreasing it. The expected result of that is that when the solar radiation heat is diminished, ice is going to grow. When it increases, ice is going to shrink. Now, when we get to the end of the late Wisconsin, which would have been, say, between 13 and 15,000 years ago, what we're seeing is a shrinkage of the ice sheet that would be consistent with the shifting Milankovitch forces, you see. But then what happened is this thing around 13,000 years ago, that was suddenly interrupted, you see. And so it's very possible that in that period of shrinkage where perhaps 10 to 15% of the ice mass was lost, right? That is when you may have had the opening up of the ice-free corridor on the western prairies of Alberta, just east of the Rocky Mountain front, that is now defined by the foothills erratics trade that we've talked about a bit, right? So that's very possibly a time when the Cordilleran ice sheet and the Laurentide ice sheet might have opened up enough to allow the migratory movements of both animals and people, right? But then that sort of more orderly, typical, it was a sort of predictable shrinking back of the ice sheet. Then we get to the significant event, the turning point, which now is actually dated closer to 12,800 years, where there was a sudden spike, a huge spike of warming, followed by this return to 1,300 years of cold, that then came to an end around 11,600 years ago.
Is the older Dryas at the late glacial maximum? Is that when that was?
The older Dryas falls between the Bolling and the Aileron,
okay,
which is right around, I think, 14.6, 14.7, very close to that, the age that's now usually given for meltwater pulse 1A. So
okay.
that point, to me, is a turning point also at 14.6 to 14.7 that really, I think, needs more scrutiny. And I would like to dig up and see what I can find on, events around that time. The meltwater pulse 1A, because see, that may have marked the first phase of the great glacial meltwater floods. That might have been the first flood that, say, went through the Scablands. But now, from the work of Teller and others in Lake Hind, which we're going to look at, we're seeing that there was catastrophic flooding there that dates right to Lake Hind is in Manitoba, and there was catastrophic flooding that took place there pretty much right at the Younger Dryas boundary, which we've been exploring it, or where we're moving with this is exploring the idea that the Younger Dryas events, impact events, somehow may have been involved in triggering these mega floods that occurred at the end of the last ice age. and somehow the combination of effects of the impact, or maybe even episodic impacts. See, this is the thing where I think we would need to be looking at. Is it possible that we had a bombardment epoch between that Pleistocene Holocene transition, where there may have been several episodes of bombardment? I think seriously we need to really be looking at that model, with perhaps the first bombardment phase at 14.6 to 14.7, another bombardment phase at 12.8, 12.9, and then perhaps even a third at 11.6. Because at each one of these, we find things happening that really, in their own way, are sort of inexplicable, right? Because when you start looking at these mega floods, the amount of energy necessary to melt so much ice to create literal tsunamis of meltwater sweeping over the land is pretty phenomenal. And where that energy is coming from is a very perplexing question. Now, is it the sun? I don't know. I don't rule out the sun. But what does that, if it's the sun, like, let's say, just hypothesize, 14.6, 14.7 years ago, could there have been some hyperactive solar event that caused that first melting episode? I don't know, because, but I would think it would, something either that or an impact would be the first two most likely things that would come to my mind. I don't know how you would go about proving that it could have been a solar event unless you could find maybe deposits of radiocarbon 14 and beryllium 10. I don't know if anybody's looked for that yet. And then we've got the 11.6 event. So right now, all of the Younger Dryas boundary stuff is focused on that 12.8, and that's where all the proxies are being found that we've been looking at. That's where the biomass burning is being found that we're looking at. Okay, so anyways, to come back to asteroid day, I think what we're seeing is we have to look at various phenomena that might have parallels to what happened at the Younger Dryas to try to get a better handle. And here, the Younger Dryas, the Tunguska event of 1908 is a supreme teaching episode from which we can learn a considerable amount of information. Like we were talking about earlier, the timing of it was interesting. 1908, because of the fact that seismographs and barographs had only recently come online. And because of the presence of seismographs, we're able to document the seismic consequences of an aerial burst. Now, that's a pretty interesting thing to find out that there's like a 5.5 earthquake generated by an aerial burst 5 miles up in the air. The other thing was, and so understanding that there were actually these terrestrial consequences of an airburst has taught us a whole lot about the nature and power of this event. Okay. The other thing is the presence of barographs, which will measure changes in atmospheric pressure. And because of the presence of the first newly installed barographs in England, there was a documentation of two pressure pulses that passed around the entire planet as a result of an explosion over Siberia. Knowing that there were these pressure waves in the atmosphere that literally encompassed the entire planet twice, again, has given us considerable insight into the nature of that event that we wouldn't have had it happened 10 to 20 years earlier. See? The other thing interesting about that is its location, because if it had happened just maybe 100, 200 miles further north, it would have been over tundra and not taiga. But because it was over taiga, where there's old growth forests, now we get to see the effects of the blast in terms of the radial tree destruction, right? So a lot of data can be extracted from that. A lot of inferences can be made as to the power of the event. Able to measure the actual square area of the destruction, right? Again, if this had happened 100 or 200 miles further north, we wouldn't have probably ever known about it. Now, see, even though the scientists in England saw the pressure waves passing over England, they didn't know what was causing that. It wasn't until over 20 years later that the dots were connected. Oh, June 30th. Yes. Atmospheric explosion in Siberia, pressure waves encompassing the planet twice. And I think they were separated. I think it took 11 hours to make the full journey around and come back again. I've forgotten the specifics, but when we get into our extended analysis of the Tunguska event, I'll have that data at my fingertips. So let's look at the, let's see, let me get my screen up here and we'll do a share screen.
I just wanted to say that if you take the length of the solar cycle, right, 22 years,
Yeah.
and you want to divide that in to get roughly, what was it, 14,700 or something
14
years ago?
Yeah, say 14.
So I'm basically, if you multiply it times 666, you get 14,652 years ago. Just saying.
Well, you may have inadvertently stumbled upon something there, Kyle, but I don't know. I think you'd better devote a couple of years to researching that and then get back to us on it.
Will do.
Okay. Wait, so what was it again? If you took the 22-year cycle times 666? No,
Yeah.
it wasn't 22.
Yeah, it puts you
14,652. There we go.
See, that's devilishly clever arithmetic.
That's right.
It's, yep.
We are in a deep
Well,
solar minimum.
that proves it, Kyle.
Yeah.
That
Obviously.
proves it.
Dr. Shock was right.
What it proves, I'm not sure. Dr. Shock, how did he get into the conversation?
The sun.
It's the sun, man.
Sun, man.
The sun. Okay.
Sorry for the distraction.
It's okay. I need a distraction every now and then. Okay, so we'll do a share screen. And why?
Well, 666 is all kind of related to the sun to start with, and that can be a whole show on its own in the future.
Oh, yeah.
More.
Okay, here we go. Here we are. There it is. So, just to get everybody kind of oriented, we have Siberia, and this area right here, all of this area is part of the Siberian Traps, which was this great magmatic outpouring that was coincidental with the Permian-Triassic boundary events and the greatest upheaval mass extinction in the history of biological life on Earth. So here's Lake Baikal, which is part of this rift system here. But so right there, which shows where the event happened. And this was one of the first papers in English that was published in 1934 after the discovery by Leonid Kulik. And this was a Russian scientist who studied the site. Published this in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society. Airwaves caused by the fall of the meteorite on 30th June 1908 in central Siberia. The flight and fall of the meteorite on 30th June 1908, amongst the greatest meteoric phenomena known to mankind, must occupy one of the foremost places because of the magnitude of the phenomena accompanying its movement through the atmosphere. If it had occurred 4 hours, 47 minutes later, when the city of Leningrad would have lain on the same parallel near the center of the explosion, our knowledge of it would probably have been considerably more extensive.
What about understatement? Lord have mercy.
Really. So I'm going to show this very briefly here because this is essentially a very abstracted map of the southern sky on June 30th. However, what is placed in there are the radiant points or the positions in space out of which various objects would be seen to emanate. So, for example, up here on the upper right, you have Earth approaching comets. And so each one of these represents the position in the sky from which an Earth approaching comet had been documented. And And we look at the letter Z in the circle. This is the position in the sky on that morning where the Tunguska object emanated from. And you'll notice that it's very close to the rising sun, which is rising here in the east, but it's even closer to the radiant point of the Beta Taurids right here. Up here are the Zeta Perseids. Geographos is an interesting object we can talk about at some point. Adonis, Icarus, the Aratids is another meteor stream. These are asteroids. And so what's interesting here is the proximity of the radiant point from which the Tunguska object emanated. And this is based upon the most exhaustive studies of the angle of approach as indicated by the blast pattern of the trees, coupled with extensive interviews with eyewitnesses. In the early days, in the 30s, a lot of them were still alive, so it was possible to interview them, collect together a lot of data on where people first reported seeing it, where they were standing when the event exploded, and so forth. And by means of collecting this data, it's possible then to sort of trace it back to the position of where it would have emanated from the sky. And you see here how close it is to the sun. Well, what that means is that when you were looking towards the east in that morning, on that morning of June 30th, you would have been looking towards the sun. And because of that, the object was invisible until pretty much the last moments before it exploded. If it had come, and so you've got two things going on here. You've got the point in space is consistent with it being a member of this Beta Taurid meteor stream, which actually peaks on June 30th, July 1st, right there. So the timing and the placement are both consistent. Now, that doesn't prove that it was part of the Taurid system, but it is really strong circumstantial evidence that it was. And we're going to come back to a discussion about the Taurid meteor system because it's very, very interesting and very important. And we're going to discover that a lot of ancient peoples were also very interested in the Taurid meteor stream. So that's kind of why the assumption is made that it's very plausible that it was a member of that family. And this ultimately would relate back to this idea that we were talking about earlier of a giant comet entering the solar system, inner solar system, say between 25 and 30 years ago, 25 and 30,000 years ago, and then begin to undergo this hierarchy of disintegrations that spawned multiple meteor streams, a couple of subcomets such as Anki and at least one more. Rudnicki is another one. Right. Several asteroids. So there we go. So let's go to the next one. And now this is a juxtaposition of two. I just grabbed this off the internet to show people, but this is probably the most famous photograph associated with the Tunguska event. And of course, you see the trees. The size of these trees is roughly 3 feet in diameter. So you had this vast area of devastation caused by the explosion. And if we go back here, it's showing the area and how the arrows are pointing in the direction that the trees are laying. So in other words, the tops of the trees are pointing away from the epicenter. Does that make sense? Because you had this tremendous blast right over this area, and then the shock wave moved out radially in all directions. And as the shock wave moved out, it just mowed down the trees, just snapped them off, and they flew down. It's estimated that somewhere around 82 million trees were instantly snapped off. That's pretty bizarre when you think about it. 82 million trees? It's a lot of damn trees. Right? Here's another photograph. So this had been old growth forest, and then moments later, it looks like this.
And they're not just blown over; all the branches are gone. It's, it looks like they've been stripped almost.
Right. And then when you get to the epicenter, it's basically just a barren zone. And then just outside the barren zone, you got a picture that the blast wave. Now the estimates is that the detonation of this object occurred 5 or 6 miles, say, above the surface, right? So you've got a picture that this blast wave is coming down. The epicenter is going to have the pressure coming down vertically, and it's going to hit the earth, and then it's going to move laterally. And of course, it's going to be super hot. It's estimated that the center of the fireball at the peak of the explosion, it was 10,000 degrees centigrade. So that's hotter than the surface of the sun. So that's pretty damn hot, right? So pretty much it created 200 square miles of combustion, instant intense combustion that pretty much left not much of anything. Outside of that blast zone, there's a ring of trees, which you can see right here, that were left vertical, right? But their branches were mostly stripped off. And then outside that ring, you start finding the trees splayed out, laid over, snapped off. So you can, because of the tree pattern, it's kind of almost possible to trace the movement of the blast wave as it comes down, strikes the earth, and then radiates out in every direction, 360 degrees. So before I go to that, we'll do this. The total area of devastation that you see here in this was over 800 square miles. The area of incineration at the epicenter was about 200 square miles. So within that 800 and some square miles, now think about this. So a 30 by 30 square would be 900 square miles. I think the area of devastation is estimated to be about 820 to 830. So you're talking about almost, if you picture a blast zone that's, going to be 28 miles or so. Let's see, we can do 825 and we square root it. That's almost 29 miles, right? That's a pretty healthy distance, isn't it? 29 miles. So if you picture a square area, 29 miles in every, on all sides, and within that area, pretty much everything is destroyed. That is a powerful blast. Now, how powerful? So what I've done is just to show a few images of nuclear tests to try to get an idea, because the estimates for the energy release during the Tunguska event are generally around 15 megatons, which means 15 million tons of TNT, right? A megaton. 15 million tons of TNT. Now, how much power was in the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima? About 15 kilotons. So 15 kilotons is 15,000 compared to 15 million. Now, so 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs going off at once would give you about a 15 megaton explosion. Now, 15 megatons, Castle Bravo. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. That was the largest nuclear bomb tested by the U.S. during the Cold War back in 1954. It was about 15 megatons. So interestingly, here's another perspective on this. Tunguska was at the bottom end, right, of the cosmic range of energies released. Maybe if we step it down one more, we'll have Chelyabinsk of 2014, right? A step up from Chelyabinsk and you're at Tunguska. A step up from that, now we're really getting into, we're talking about objects, that might be, 4 to 10 times more massive than Tunguska. And now we're getting into an object that, let's say, Tunguska, we could call that a city killer. And I'll show you just, I've taken a map of Atlanta and superimposed this area of destruction on that, which I'll show you in a minute. So that, but you'll be able to roughly compare. Atlanta's, going to be the same size metro areas as most of the other major cities in the U.S., right? So 15 megatons. Now, the largest hydrogen bomb ever tested by the human race was Tsar Bomba, which was 1962, and that was the Soviet Union detonated a bomb in Siberia, as a matter of fact, and it was estimated to be 55 megatons. But thankfully, we got through that intense period of the Cold War without committing mass suicide. That's another subject we should talk about, since we're actually sort of in a new Cold War with Russia even as we speak. Not a good development, but anyhow. So let's go on and we'll look at a few actual photographs of nuclear explosions. I've taken from the French testing, because the French continued to, tested atmospherically, up to, years after the U.S. and the Soviet Union had quit testing. These U.S. signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, and this basically limited nuclear testing to only underground nuclear tests and not above ground atmospheric tests. And the Soviet Union and the U.S. tested that, signed that treaty. The French did not sign it. So they continued and they developed their own nuclear program and then did a lot of testing, around the turn of from the 60s to the 70s. So this first photograph is going to be from Bikini Atoll. Oops. And it's going to show a 1 megaton explosion. Actually a little bit less than a megaton. And this is an actual photograph. Here it is, July 3rd. So it actually interestingly occurred during the Taurid meteor shower, because the Taurid meteor stream of the Earth actually takes almost a full week to cross the Taurid meteor stream. So here we have the French nuclear test carried out on Fangatofa Atoll, July 3rd, 1970, yield 914 kilotons. So remember I said Hiroshima was 15 kilotons, if that. So 914 divided by 15. This thing is then 60 times more powerful. Is that right? Yeah.
Pretty
Than
close.
the Hiroshima bomb. Okay, so this is a little bit less than 1 megaton. Now, 15 megatons, now we're talking about 15 times greater than what you see right here. Red Wing Dakota, which was a test in 1956, a little bit more than a megaton, 1.1 megatons. So this is a pretty damn big explosion right here. You can see it, it's the mushroom cloud is advancing up into the stratosphere. Another 1 megaton explosion, like Lecorne nuclear tests on Fangatofa Atoll, 1970, yield 1 megaton. So again, 15, the largest hydrogen bomb in the U.S. arsenal ever tested, 15 times more powerful than what you see right here. And now we're getting up into the range of, the lower range of cosmic energies, you see. So as we go up the scale, the power of controlled by humans that we see represented right here, we're getting into the bottom end of the energies generated during a cosmic, even a small cosmic event. And now we're up to 4 megatons. So we really can see here that the whole mushroom cloud, the fireball, is rising right up into the stratosphere. And then finally, yeah, here's another one of another photo of Castle Romeo. This is nice. So now this, of course, is the U.S. And then we have the largest hydrogen bomb tested by the U.S., Castle Bravo, 1954, 15 megatons. Now, I found a really cool painting on the internet that would show to give some sense of scale, a 15 megaton explosion, say relative to a typical urban area the size of Atlanta or New York or Washington or Detroit or Philadelphia or any of the major cities, right? One more image of the Castle Bravo, largest hydrogen bomb tested by the U.S. And you can see here, it's going right above the cloud layer, right up into the stratosphere. Okay, so now the next image will kind of give you the sense of what a 15 megaton explosion would look like juxtaposed on a major urban area. So what you got to take away from this is that we had a naturally occurring explosion in 1908 that was on this scale right here. And right under the fireball would be where the 200 square miles of combustion destroyed everything. And then radiating out from that for another 15 to 20 miles in every direction was the blast wave that mowed over the forests. So that's why we would call that a city killer.
Randall, are these the photos you're showing? Are these air bursts or surface bursts?
They're probably surface bursts. There was a whole series of tests done. Some done for surface, some aerial bursts, some actually below the ocean, and some underground. While we're looking here, maybe Kyle would look up Castle Bravo, 1954, and it'll probably tell us. I think a lot of the testing were mounted on towers, and then of course detonated remotely.
Yeah, but on these particularly the ones on the atolls in the South Pacific, my thinking is that they were probably surface bursts, like out on ships or on the atolls themselves.
Yeah, but I think they were mounted on towers, and maybe
Okay.
Kyle will tell us here if he. Castle Bravo, 1954.
Yeah, we're looking.
Aha.
We are looking it up.
So here is the map of Atlanta. Here's 285, which is very close, let's say, to the perimeter interstate that surrounds Washington, D.C. in area. Okay,
it's about 65 miles in circumference.
In circumference. Okay, interesting.
Okay, it says the device was mounted on a shot cab on an artificial island built on a reef off Namu Island.
On a what?
Shot cab. I don't know what that is, but
Shot cab.
Yeah, so it was mounted on something close to the ground. Probably it wasn't dropped or anything.
No, it wasn't dropped. It was definitely
Yeah.
not dropped.
Right.
A shot cab. Okay, I wonder if that's what they're calling. It undoubtedly was mounted on some kind of a device. The question is how high up off the ground. Now, when Trinity was detonated, which was the first atomic bomb, plutonium bomb, that was detonated in New Mexico, it was definitely on a pretty tall tower. So it was not actually on the ground. And the Hiroshima bomb was detonated in the air because of the fact that the radius of destruction is greater when the explosion occurs in the atmosphere than when it actually strikes the earth, because so much of the energy is absorbed in the impact into the earth itself, which sort of localizes it much more so than when the energy is free to expand outwards as it is in the atmosphere. And so Hiroshima was detonated in the atmosphere in order to generate maximum destruction, maximum death and destruction. So here's the city of Atlanta, 285, the perimeter highway, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to superimpose that butterfly-shaped area of devastation over the city so that you can kind of get a sense of the scale. So you can see that pretty much the area of destruction is very, very close to the area inside the perimeter interstate. And since this perimeter interstate is similar to many of those in other urban areas, large urban areas around the U.S., or Europe for that matter, you can see that this is why it's referred to as a city killer, because it's large enough to pretty much wipe out any large city on Earth, were it to explode, say, over that city.
I just wanted to throw in the shot cab is the name for a large corrugated aluminum building where the bomb is mounted.
Mounted, okay.
It's what they call the shot cab.
Okay, and so
so it must have been just on the ground in a building.
Yeah, but undoubtedly it was mounted on something in a building. Yes, in a building. Probably not just sitting right on the ground, though. Just sitting in the dirt.
I have seen the image of the ones from the towers, because it incinerates the guide wires that were holding the tower, and you can follow that along with the mushroom cloud going up. You see these orange streaks shooting down, and it's the guide wires are just being instantly incinerated.
That are stabilizing the tower.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So by looking at our own experimentation with nuclear weapons helps us to understand the kinds of forces we're talking about here with these impact events. And the thing about these impact events is that, there's a scaling ratio in that the smaller the object, the more frequent we can assume that encounters with those size objects are going to be. So the question is how often does the Earth encounter a Tunguska-sized object? So we can make assumptions about that. A lot of those assumptions have been, if we just sort of randomly encounter objects of that scale, maybe once every 100 to 200 years, I think is a very typical periodicity that I've seen. But now, to this, there's no particular repetitive pattern or periodicity. In most of those assumptions, you can say, Tunguska was just a random event. Now, how often do these random events happen? Well, maybe on average, a century every 2 centuries. Of course, even there, that would imply that, when is the next Tunguska scale event going to happen? And when it does, it's a different world now than it was in 1908. A lot more people live in, what would have happened, like in that quote that I read from Astapovich, what would be the effect if it had happened 4 hours and 47 minutes later? Well, it would have wiped Leningrad off the map. Well, if that had happened, it's very possible that 20th century history would have been drastically different. Certainly, right?
Probably
and our awareness of threats from space would have been well established in the human psyche, 4 generations, 5 generations ago. As it is, we've gone blithely along, oblivious to what's happening over our heads, unlike our ancestors, who we will show everywhere were intensely concerned about things going on in the heavens. Now, what we need, I think, to be cognizant of is the fact that if, for example, the Tunguska event was part of the Taurid system, then that opens the possibility of there being periodic events. Because the question is, if Tunguska, which is estimated to be about, say, 50 meters in diameter, that's not really big, I mean, if it was sitting on the ground, you'd go, yeah, that's a hell of a big rock or a big snowball or something in between, right? But, think of that, 50 feet, that's a 5-story building, right? So, yeah, it's big. You wouldn't want the thing to land on you. But in cosmic terms, it's pretty tiny, right? If you set it next to an object that was half a mile in diameter, it would just be this little thing next to this, right? An object a half a mile in diameter now, that's going to be an object that could wipe out an area the size of Texas, as an example.
No way, bro.
Not possible to wipe out Texas.
Well, at least not while you guys are living here anyway. So, but Tunguska about 50 meters, so say 150 feet in diameter. Well, Tunguska object being presumably a cometary mass is going to be at the low end of the density spectrum, close to the density of ice, maybe a little more, depending on what constituents, what was it composed of. But if it was pure ice, then it would be about, roughly a gram per cubic centimeter. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the iron asteroids, which is a whole family unto themselves. And then, and they're about 6 to 7 grams per cubic centimeter. So picture, if you will, think about this. In this hand, you're holding, let's say, a chunk of ice, right? And in this hand, you're holding a piece of cast iron. And that's the difference in range right there. And then in between, you've got a full gradation of different densities, with chondritic asteroids being roughly right in the middle, right? Stony asteroids being generally a little bit more dense than the chondritic asteroids, I think, in most cases. So you figure, okay, you've got a chunk of ice in this hand, you got a piece of cast iron in this hand, and then in your third hand, you're holding a stone, basically a typical rock. That is, if you are from Zeta Reticuli, because they have 3 arms. So they could be holding a rock in the middle that would be a typical rock, 3.5 grams per cubic centimeter. So that's pretty typical. And each one of those coming into the atmosphere at a high rate of speed is going to have a different kind of effect once it impacts. Now, the lower the density, the more likely it's going to be to not be able to penetrate the full atmospheric column and strike the ground. The high density objects are going to be much more likely, even the small ones, to penetrate the atmosphere and strike the ground. Now, once you get up to about 1 kilometer in diameter, even the low density ones are going to penetrate the full atmospheric column and strike the ground. Although probably an object 1 or 2 grams per cubic centimeter, when it strikes the ground, is going to leave a different suite of features than one that's 7 grams per cubic centimeter. You see? So there's a lot to sort out here. And then on top of that, you've got the angle of entry, you've got the nature of the target rocks, all of that stuff. Speed. What happens with oceanic? See, now, as we were talking about earlier, there's pretty close to about 200 now confirmed and probable impact craters around the surface of the Earth, and the vast majority of these are terrestrial, right? And yet, the continental land masses are only a little more than a quarter of the Earth's surface area. So it would be safe to assume that if there's 200 confirmed so far, and, undoubtedly there's going to be more, what's hiding under just like, look what just has happened in the last few years. We've discovered potentially 2 craters hiding under the Greenland ice, right? Are there craters under the Antarctic ice? Are there craters that we don't know about, Brazilian rainforest? Are there craters that are, or astrobleams that might be buried under even a few hundred feet of sediment, so we don't really see them? Or in the case of the KT impact, the Chicxulub impact crater in Mexico, it's under almost a 0.5 kilometer of limestone, because it happened 66 million years ago, and you've had in a shallow marine environment where you have accumulating limestone rock. So it's certainly safe to say that at some point we may reach 250 known or probable impact craters, astrobleams, terrestrial. But then we have to assume that there's going to be 3 to 4 times as many impacts into the oceans, right? I mean, unless you're going to argue to me that the influx of these objects is selective over terrestrial targets, and I don't see any evidence of that or any reason or logical reason to make that assumption, we then have to assume that for every 1 impact, boom, into the surface of the Earth, there might be 3 or 4 impacts into the oceans. So we need to now be thinking about what are the consequences of an impact into the ocean. And of course, there are a couple of things, a couple of factors. One is the impact, is the object large enough to penetrate the full water column and strike the floor of the ocean, or is it going to basically vaporize in the water column itself without actually penetrating the ocean floor? So that would be a consideration. Now, if you had one that actually excavated a crater on the ocean floor, well, now what you've got to say, okay, well, here's the crater. Now what's going to happen because it's on the bottom of an ocean rather than, say, a crater on land? Now, and we know on crater on land, there's an impact, there's a pressure wave that moves out, and then that creates a vacuum and it collapses back in. And we know that breccia will be thrown up into the atmosphere and fall back into the crater, while at the same time there'll be a strewn field around the crater where the fallback material mantles the landscape. If the object comes in at an angle, it'll actually preferentially eject the impact material in the direction from its trajectory into the atmosphere. So it will not be radially distributed around the point of impact. It will be, it'll be distributed around in a pattern, probably elliptical, right? So, but what happens in an ocean event? Well, you'll have the ocean will open up. There'll be a transient crater produced, just like there is in the ground, except now, once that outward moving pressure diminishes, then the water column will collapse back inwards. Of course, now when it's collapsing back in, it's going to be carrying a whole lot of sediment back in with it. And all of that water, in fact, it's even been given a name, the resurge wave. So the resurge wave is going to collapse back into the submarine crater, and it's going to bring a lot of sedimentary infill with it. And if there's a raised rim around the crater, that inrush of water will tend to smooth out and lower or eliminate the rim altogether. So it's going to be harder to identify impacts into the oceans for that reason. However, I will predict that as we get more and more, we've mapped now about in detail about 1/4 of the ocean's floor. We've got 3/4 of the floor to go, and I don't know yet because I haven't had an opportunity to look to find out if anybody's actually going, okay, now that we're getting these detailed maps of the ocean floor, can we study these maps to determine if there's indications of impacts? And again, the problem here is because if you start looking for what you'd expect to find on land, you may miss it because it may be a different phenomenon altogether. Now, if the object is not big enough to actually penetrate the full water column and excavate a crater on the ocean floor, then what are you going to look for?
And I know you're going to get into this again because it links directly back to Tunguska, but there's a whole much larger number of the ones that are air bursts. So
yes.
It's going to move some water out of the way, or it's going to create a shallow crater, and in 1,000 years it's going to be gone, and we're going to have no evidence.
Right.
So
What Brad just?
I know you're going to.
Yeah.
You're going to jump into that some more, but I'm just want to say we're about an hour in, so if we can slow down, take a break here. Are you ready for a break?
Sure. Ready for a break.
Let's halt, and we'll be right back.
Okay.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I guess we're going to wrap up this Asteroid Day extravaganza. Where are we going next there, Randall?
Well, Kyle, I thought perhaps we would just do a very quick run through of a group of craters to give people an idea of some of the things that have been documented and look at some of the astrobleams, the actual stars in the landscape with relative energies of these events. So we will do our share screen and this. So this is the famous meteor crater in Arizona. I got approximately 26,000 years old here. I don't know if that's correct. Most of the estimates I've seen are 40 to 50,000 years. I think there have been some studies suggesting it's a little younger, though, like at the age I've got here. The age is not so important right now. The main thing is to understand is that this was created by the impact of an iron object. So interestingly, it was about the same size as the Tunguska object. So it kind of gives us a means of comparison. And of course, the difference being the much greater density of the meteor crater in Arizona that meteorite is why it hit the ground and created this hole in the ground that's just obvious to anybody, and why Tunguska did not create a hole in the ground like this. So estimates here were about 20 megatons. So given that the estimate for the Tunguska, I used 15 megatons because that's the one usually cited, but there have been estimates up to 30 megatons for the total energy released by the Tunguska event. I think most of the estimates that I've seen range from around 12 to up to 30 megatons. I kind of stayed the more conservative side, which is 15 megatons, which I think is closer to the majority of the estimates, but certainly it gives some idea, gives one the idea of the destructions involved. So we're going to just run through here looking at just a gallery of some various impact craters, along with some sense of the energies released. So Lonar, India has a lake in it, about 500,000 years old. It's 1.1 miles in diameter, so that's certainly bigger than the meteor crater, which was the one we just looked at, which is 3/5 of a mile in diameter. So this is just roughly about twice the diameter. And I've got there 20 megatons, which is actually on the conservative side. It might be closer to 25 or even 30 megatons. That happens to be about roughly 1,400 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs exploding at once, just to give you some sense of the power. This is in Ontario, Holaford crater. Now, this one is very obscure. It's almost more of an astrobleem than a crater, because it's definitely a scar, but it's healed a long ways because it's obviously become eroded, infilled with sediment, but you can certainly see the circularity of it. And it's a very old one, so that's consistent with its degree of erosion. As it says here, diameter 1.46 miles. At that point, the explosive energy is about 42 megatons. So now we're getting up into the range of Tsar-Bomba, which I remember I said was 55 megatons, which was the largest hydrogen nuclear bomb ever tested during the Cold War by the Soviet Union, which was more than 3 times the power of Bravo, which was the U.S.'s largest hydrogen bomb. 2,800 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs exploding at once. Australia, this is a really old one, diameter about 2 miles. So this is like, again, a scar, an impact scar, an astrobleem. Astrobleem literally translates as star wound. So we're up to about 125 megatons for one that size. The BP structure in Libya, which is about 120 million years old. It's almost 2 miles in diameter. So it's going to be about 125 megatons, right in that range. Some of these are old. Here's a better shot of the same BP structure, maybe with some recalculations, because probably the other one was an older version, because I've been putting these things together maybe for 25 years. So sometimes I update them, and then other times I don't update them, and some of the information may have become dated in the process but the point here is not the precise details of this, but in this case what we're looking at is to try to get a general concept of the energies involved. I've always been fond of this. Steinem Basin in Germany, about 14.8 million years old, 2 miles in diameter. There's actually 2 villages built right inside the crater. And notice the flatness of it in the farmland, which shows that the crater has been infilled with a lot of sediment. So this would have been roughly about 8,000 Hiroshima bombs exploding at one time. We come up Brent Crater in central Ontario, also about 2 miles in diameter. Now, a lot of craters in Canada, and I think one reason for that is that because of the successive glaciations over Canada, a lot of the upper layers of the bedrock have been scraped away. And so they've kind of exposed some of the astroblems that might otherwise be more obscured under the top layers of rock. And you'll notice that a lot of them do have lakes in them. And here you can very clearly see the circularity. And this is probably the inner part of the crater. There may have been a raised rim around here. Chubb crater in northern Quebec, also about 2 miles in diameter, and it's an almost perfectly circular lake. This is Flint Creek structure in Tennessee, which is kind of in our backyard, and this is probably one of the 34th parallel chain of craters, which we're going to look at and talk about in detail, because right across from east to west in the mid-central region of the United States, there's an interesting array of craters and crypto explosion structures that are almost aligned in a pattern. Some of them are proven to be impact. Now, this is the Flint Creek structure, and this is just a digital elevation model, but very clearly the central uplift peak shows up. The rim is highly distorted, probably because of tectonic processes, because it's a very old, about 360 million years old, 2.2 miles in diameter, 180 megatons or 12,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs, goat paddock in Western Australia, imprecisely dated, less than 50 million years old. Now we're up to 3 miles in diameter, explosive energy about 500 megatons. So we're getting up into some serious energy here now. 500 megaton explosion, we could consider that a state killer. An object like that striking the center of Texas is going to be pretty much leave most of Texas depopulated in the aftermath. Gow Crater, Saskatchewan, 3 miles in diameter. This remnant of the central uplift is an island. Notice how the rim has been so obscured and eroded. Well, for two reasons for that. One, the glaciation itself, and then the rapid melting of the glacier and very vigorous meltwater currents also contributing to further extreme erosion. But the feature is still there, and it can actually be roughly dated, but it's less than 250 million years old. So Pilot Crater, Northwest Territories, again, we're looking at Canada, 3.6 miles in diameter, explosive energy, over 1,000 megatons now, 1,060 megatons. And this is based upon a simple formula that only gives you approximately a ballpark idea of the energies. And it's basically a formula that's derived from known impacts and nuclear explosion energy is released, craters produced, etc., to come up with a simple ratio between crater size and impact energies. But of course, there's a lot of variability in there, depending on the nature of the impactor, its velocity, the nature of the target material, and so on. So this is only just a rough approximation, but it does give you the idea. It gets you in the ballpark. Decaturville, Missouri, diameter 4 miles. That puts us up there again in that 1,000 plus megatons. The Decaturville, Missouri structure is also one of these 34th parallel crater chain that we're going to look at in more detail. Brad and I have actually visited several of those. I think maybe even 3 of them, of the 9 or 10 of them. Crooked Creek, Missouri. This is another one that could be possibly related to this crater chain. It's 4.34 miles in diameter. Check this out, 1,792 megatons. So that's 120,000 Hiroshima bombs all exploding at once. So we're getting up to some pretty significant energies. Another one, Couture, Quebec, Canada, 5 miles in diameter. At 5 miles now, we're up to 2,800 megatons. Now, during the peak of the Cold War, the entire nuclear arsenal of both the United States and the Soviet Union is estimated to have been roughly around 10,000 megatons. All thousands of warheads. This would have been in the 60s and 70s. But of course, what happened was as the Cold War and the arms race evolved from the 50s through the 60s to the 70s, the strategy went from mutual assured destruction, relying on the ability to deliver one nuclear weapon. If you deliver a nuclear weapon of 10 megatons or 15 megatons, well, what's going to happen is one bomb is going to wipe out the entire city, right? but it's not very precise. I mean, when you're looking at a bomb of that scale, you know, it's not pinpoint precision is not really too critical. It's really what you're doing during mutual assured destruction doctrine. The idea was each side was holding its cities hostage. It was holding its urban areas hostage. Well, if you attack us, we're going to wipe your cities out. Now, throwing a 10 megaton bomb at a city, it's not going to matter really whether it falls on point A or point B a mile away. The city is gone. You follow me? So what we see as the arms race evolved from the 50s to the 60s into the 70s is that the size of the nuclear warheads decreased considerably. Why? Because the strategy went from being able to wipe out an entire city to being able to take out a specific target with a high degree of accuracy, you see. But in order to do that, the throw weights riding on the delivery systems, the missiles, had to be reduced, because the throw weight of a 10 megaton bomb is such that, you know, there's no way to incorporate it and integrate it with the really sophisticated guidance systems, like, say, if you were using a 100 kilo or 200 kiloton weapon. So, but of course, now when you've reduced the size of the warhead, what you do is you can increase the number of warheads. So part of the evolution of nuclear strategy was you decrease the size of the warheads. And now, you see, in the early days, you had one delivery vehicle, a rocket, and you had one warhead mounted on that rocket, right? As it evolved, they developed systems where you could mount multiple warheads on one single delivery vehicle, you see. Now, of course, you couldn't mount 10 or 15 megaton warheads and get 10 of them, you know, a bus of 10 of them mounted onto one rocket, because they were too big. But now reducing them gave that ability to have this multiple warhead delivery system. Of course, now when you're going for precision, you see, you're actually looking at an entirely different strategic doctrine for mutual assured destruction. Mutual assured destruction, again, is the idea is that we're holding your city hostage. You attack us, we can drop one bomb and Moscow is gone, right? So why would you want pinpoint accuracy? What do you think there, Kyle?
Well, you can take out specific targets to reduce threats without wiping out entire populations.
Well, yes, you can. That's the idea. But when you say specific targets, that's the key right there. Because what kind of targets are you looking to take out?
Military targets.
Military targets, exactly. So that was the evolution of nuclear doctrine, to go into these smaller warheads. But see, there's an interesting analogy here, as you're going to find out as we get into this, because what we're looking at here is like one big, you know, like here, what are we saying, 2008? This is like one big warhead. Boom, right? What we're going to look at, though, is the idea that you might have clustered events where a lot smaller things, like this thing would be 5 miles in diameter, the crater, you can figure that the object that created this crater is going to be between 1/10 and 1/20th the size of the crater that it produces. So if you've got, let's say, 5 miles, which is 5,280 times 5, and we divide that, say, by 15 to put it in the mid-range, we're looking at an object that's going to be roughly 2,000 feet in diameter, right? Tunguska object was about 150 feet in diameter. Now we're up to 2,000 feet in diameter, see? So the point is once you get to that size, even the low density objects like Tunguska are going to tend to make it through the atmosphere to strike the Earth, you see. So 2,000 feet roughly in diameter. And that's you know, and this is, again, approximate because there's so many variables here, but it kind of gives you the idea. Let's move on, because this is Gyges, I don't know, Kazakhstan, approximately 5 million years old, 5 miles. So here's 2,800 megatons again. We'll keep going. Shoemaker, Australia, named after Eugene Shoemaker, who was studying this particular crater when he was killed in a bizarre accident in the outback of Australia. And I don't have the size of this, so let's see, I might have it. No, don't have it. So, but it doesn't matter. La Moyniere, Quebec, 400 plus or minus 50 million years, 5 miles in diameter, 2,820 megatons. Keep going. This is Upheaval Dome, Utah, less than 65 million years old, 6 miles in diameter, explosive energy. Now we're up to about 6,000 megatons. Remember, I said that the peak of the Cold War, the total nuclear arsenals of the U.S. and the Soviet Union was 10, maybe 12,000 megatons. That was considered to be pretty much enough to destroy the world if it was all unleashed in a, in a nuclear
scenario.
exchange, right? So Brad and I actually visited this one. It's pretty impressive because it's an astrobleme that was undoubtedly buried and has had the top layers of rock stripped away to expose this thing that was, at one time buried beneath the surface of the land. And you see remnants of the old land surface around it in the rim. Look at this central uplift here. So this would be a really cool expedition. In fact, we would add this to the list in one of our undoubtedly future expeditions into the Colorado Plateau and Canyonlands area, because this is in it's in Canyonlands, right, Brad?
Yeah, that's what I was going to add there. That's the Green River right up at the top. So that is
Yeah.
within the Canyonlands National Park in Utah, southern Utah.
Right. Sweet. Okay. Eagle Butte. This one's hard to see, but I put in a circle. Again, a lot of these are really obscure, and from the ground, you wouldn't even know they're there. So this is more like an astrobleme rather than a crater, because the scar is still there. And then you do the studies and you find all the impact proxy material, or you find shocked quartz, or you find brecciated rock, which is broken rock, or you might find some melt glass. Many of the different various ways that craters are identified and confirmed. So check this out, 6 miles, 5,300 megatons. Basumtwi in Africa, 6.5 miles, over 7,000 megatons. Now Deep Bay, Saskatchewan, diameter 7.2 miles. Notice 9,950 megatons. So we're now getting up close to the total megatonnage in the arsenals of the superpowers during the peak of the Cold War, which thankfully never got unleashed in an all-out thermonuclear war, or we would probably not be having this congenial conversation right now. So as you can see here, yeah, now we're getting up in the scale. This thing is, like it says here, 7.2 miles in diameter. Here's one in Brazil, also about 7.2 miles in diameter, so the energies would have been equivalent. Zhamanshin, Kazakhstan. This is young, less than 1 million years old, 8.7 miles. Notice here, 18,900 megatons. So now we have exceeded, and this thing, if you can see it, it's right in here. Let's see, I might have it. No, I don't. But so now we're well beyond the total megatonnage of the entire nuclear arsenals.
So less than 1 million years ago, there was an
years
event
ago.
there that released more than the entire megatonnage of the Cold War arsenal. That's
All being exploded at once.
in the same place.
Yes.
Kazakhstan.
In Kazakhstan.
In Kazakhstan. Yes, so you can see that would have been a pretty significant event. So it'd be interesting to look and see if there's any evidence of, extreme sudden climate change in this area, any mass extinction events, any biotic turnovers, which I haven't done, but of course it'd be interesting to look, because I would think that an 18,900 megaton explosion would have to have some kind of substantial effect that would leave residuals that could be studied today. Wells Creek, Tennessee. We also visited this one, and there is there's a quarry we didn't get into, but there's a quarry. I think didn't we learn in the Central Uplift, Brad? We met the gentleman who had property adjacent to the roadway into the quarry. was Wells Creek, wasn't it?
I don't think it was right in the central uplift.
Oh, okay.
I think
But
that's
we
the
did-
Tennessee River coming across there right at the top.
Yeah. So we didn't get in there. So that's probably worth a return trip at some time. It would be really interesting to get into that quarry. We did get into the quarry and took a tour of the quarry in the Kentland impact structure in Indiana, and that was really interesting, especially
You're
because
talking
you could really see the uplifted rocks and the very prominent and impressive shatter cones.
Oh yeah.
a quarry or a mine?
A quarry,
Okay.
like a surface open pit quarry that's basically, extracting rock and gravel and things.
Yeah. Okay.
Spider Crater, 8 miles, energy 14,710 megatons. And here we go, Texas, Sierra Madera. That's a big one, 8 miles in diameter. Less than 100 million. How much less? I don't know. Maybe since I did this is an old program I did. I'm probably going back 12, 15 years ago. But there's maybe a lot of updated information that could be incorporated into this. But at this point, again, it's not so much the exact specifics, but at least to get kind of a general idea, a general comprehension of it.
I've driven through that one.
You have driven through that, huh?
Yes, and there is mining stuff at the central uplift. You can see all the equipment.
Ooh, interesting. I wonder
Yes.
if they could be contacted and we could go in it, because that's what we did. We contacted the quarry owners or maybe we just drove on in and asked them if they would, and they were happy to give us a tour. We all put on our hard hats and down we went.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
They can be contacted. Just don't be trespassing on the property.
Yeah. Okay. Ames, Oklahoma. Look at there, 10 miles in diameter. Some of these, of course, are just terrain modeled because they don't really show up too clearly from the surface. But again, a lot of research is ongoing, and I haven't been able to keep up with the most, up-to-date information on all of this. 10 miles in diameter is now 29,800. So we're close to 30,000 megatons. So now this object here, explosion, we're getting, in the range of 3 times the entire nuclear arsenal. Arunga, Chad. This one I've always thought was quite interesting. 10.2 miles, 36,600 megatons. That's 2.4 million Hiroshima bombs going off at once. This astrobleme is part of a multiple impact event. It looks like that there's another right up here. You can see it in the upper right-hand corner. And then above that, there appears to be even a third impact scar. So this could have been an object that was coming in fragmented, probably an early fragmentation, and in the sense that it hadn't had much time for the parts, the 3 objects, if they were in fact that they were originally one object, for them to become separated very far. I've never really known how to pronounce How would you say this, Kyle?
Yeah, I think you had it right. El-Jijitjin.
Yeah, Russia. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, getting up there, Gosses Bluff, Australia, 14 miles in diameter. And here you see a central uplift ring, which I think is interesting. And Reese, Germany, 14.4 miles, less than 15 million years old. So that puts it back early Pliocene. I heard a sound. Hot and Astrobleme, Northwest Territories, 7.9 million. We'll just skim through these. Notice you're up to 20 miles here in diameter here. Explosive energy, 200,000 megatons. Now we're getting into a serious global event with the ones that are following. 20 miles. So we're looking, here we go, Shoemaker. Approximately 20 miles, less than 5 million years.
Only 5 million?
Yes.
Wow.
Which is interesting because notice I've mentioned before the Hemphillian extinction that was about 5 million years ago. I was saying that, if you look at the late Pleistocene extinction and then you go back in time to find an equivalent extinction level event, you're back at the Hemphillian, as it's called, and that's usually dated at about 5 million years. Is there a connection? I don't know. Maybe it's just a coincidence. but maybe there is a connection. 17.5 miles, 200,000 megatons. And then we get to Clearwater Lakes. This one's always been fascinating to me. This is like a tandem or a dual impact. Two objects, are they simultaneous in impact time, or are they separated in time? I don't know the answer to that. I think most of the assumptions are that it was like a twin object that they impacted simultaneous. There may be new studies on it showing that were not exactly simultaneous. I don't know. But notice here, West Crater over here, which has a central uplift ring, is 19.2 miles in diameter, and the Eastern Crater is 13.2. The combined explosive energy, 400,000 megatons.
So that's like the size of the Hiawatha right there, that 19.2 miles.
Yeah. Now, we are now looking at certainly global scale event here. You know, maybe not enough to cause the kind of mass extinction we saw at the KT or Permian Triassic boundaries, but certainly enough to have global ramifications. Carswell, Saskatchewan, 23.5 miles, over 600,000 megatons. Here's one in Araguaia, Brazil, 25 miles in diameter. Karakul in Tajikistan, again, notice here, 5 million years old. So is it possible we're looking at a bombardment period? 28 miles in diameter. So again, here's two major craters on different sides of the Earth coinciding roughly with a mass extinction level event.
All right, I'm going to sign off.
Are
Thank
they
you
connected?
for watching.
I don't know, because I
would
have to really go in and
thank you for watching.
get a very accurate
Have a good night.
chronology in order to try to tie these together. But what we're seeing here with